thank you very much to Pilecki Institute for this invitation. My reason for being here, I suppose, is I've been writing about the Wadash group now for, well, I've been working on it for a couple of years. I found out about this the tail end of, I think, 2018. I was alerted to this story. And I found it fascinating, and through collaboration with the Pilecki Institute and, of course, Jakob Kumoch, who's very central to this story, the discovery of this story, I have managed to have book contract for the UK and US and for Poland now as well. So we'll have a book on this subject will come out. Hopefully the beginning of 2023, which sounds a long time away, I'm sorry, but that's how it is. So that's sort of my background in this subject. I should, by way of a sort of disclaimer, I should probably say that I come to this as much to learn as to teach, and certainly I know Monika Miniewska, who I know has been a great correspondent to me and a great help to me. I know she knows this stuff backwards and very, very well. So I feel rather an imposter speaking before she does, but I'm sure she'll correct any mistakes that I make in due course. So to my subject, the genesis of the Wadash passport operation. As is now increasingly well known, thanks primarily to the work of the Pilecki Institute and the former Polish ambassador in Switzerland, who I mentioned, Jakob Kumoch, the Wadash passport operation was one of the largest passport forgery operations of the war, creating identity documents that were issued to an estimated 8 to 10,000 people, enabling an unknown but surely significant proportion of them to survive the Holocaust. There were 6 members of the Wadash group, i.e. those that knew all the details of the passport operation. I'll just go into share screen to show you who they were, just on that particular, there we go, hopefully you can see that. 4 of those were members of Polish diplomatic staff, and 2 Jewish representatives of prominent aid organizations. The diplomatic staff were as follows: the Polish ambassador in Switzerland at the time, Alexander Wadash, who you can see top left. He was a 48-year-old former diplomat turned journalist who had briefly served as a minister in the government in exile before his appointment to Switzerland in 1940. And he was assisted by 2 of his deputies. Bottom left, Stefan Ryniewicz was a 36-year-old councillor, and in the middle at the top, Konstanty Rokicki was 40-year-old vice consul in Bern. Ryniewicz and Rokicki were friends. They'd served together in the Polish consulate in Minsk in the 1930s, and Ryniewicz had even been Rokicki's best man at his wedding. And both men were already installed in the embassy in Bern by the time of Wadash's appointment in the spring of 1940. The 4th of the diplomatic staff was Juliusz Kuhl, who was 26, in the center at the bottom. He was a Polish-born Jew who had grown up and studied in Switzerland and had been employed from 1940 as an informal advisor on Jewish matters. The other 2 Jewish members of the group were Abraham Silberschein, top right, who was 58, and Chaim Eis, who was 64, the oldest of the six, both of whom provided the vital link to Jewish refugee and aid organizations. Silberschein, incidentally, had traveled to Switzerland in August of 1939 for a meeting of the World Zionist Congress and had been effectively stranded there by the outbreak of war. So he turned his stranding into something much more positive by assisting fugitive Jews. All 6 of them were Polish-born, though Chaim Eis and Juliusz Kuhl had spent most of their lives already in Switzerland. And interestingly, 5 of the 6, the exception being Konstanty Rokicki, had been born in the Kresy in eastern Poland. specifically in the voivodeship of Lwów. And both Silberschein and Wadash came from Lwów itself. I don't suggest this is necessarily historically significant, but I'd be very interested to hear from those that perhaps do see this as significant. Perhaps there's someone out there that does. There were other significant contributors to the operation, of course, not least among them Rudolf Hugley, who was the Paraguayan honorary consul in Bern. Not much is known about Hugley, unfortunately. He's a rather shadowy character, but he was the one who sold the blank passports and identity papers and signed the finished documents before they were sent out. But it's thought that only these six that I'm talking about here, Wadash, Reniewicz, Rokicki, Kuhl, Silberschein, and Eis, only these six were fully aware of all of the activities of the group. So this is generally considered to be the extent of the Wadash group, of the Bern group. For those unaware, it's worth briefly explaining how the Wadash operation worked. Names, birth dates, and photographs of what we might call would-be Paraguayans, i.e. those Jews usually in occupied Poland who are keen to escape or keen to better their chances of escape at least, those details were usually sent to representatives of the Jewish aid organizations in Switzerland, people like Chaim Eis and Abraham Silberschein, who then passed them on to Julius Kuhl at the Polish embassy in Bern. Just do the next slide there to give a couple of examples. Blank passports were then purchased from the honorary consuls, primarily Rudolf Hugley, who represented Paraguay, which were then completed mostly by Konstanty Rokicki before being returned to Hugley for signature. Those finished documents, or in most cases, or a lot of cases, I think facsimiles thereof, were then sent back to the applicants either by post or using the underground courier networks. And those were then brandished at the moment, perhaps of deportation, or at some point to evade the mechanisms of the Holocaust. So this became, in effect, the passport to potential freedom for the holder of that passport. In some cases, where photographs, for example, were not available, or the life details were not available, in some cases, letters were sent out which merely confirmed citizenship, but fell short of constituting a formal passport. So the two examples you can see on this page here, on the left, you have Paraguayan passport, effectively, this rather sort of rather scrawly cursive script, the handwritten script where it's filled out is that of Konstanty Rokicki. That's very distinctive. As I said, he filled out most of these documents. And at the bottom, hopefully you can see the signature of Rudolf Hugley himself, the Paraguayan honorary consul in Bern. On the right-hand side, as I said, this is one of these examples of a citizenship document. So this is merely a letter from the consul of Paraguay in Bern, signed again by Rudolf Hugley at the bottom, but essentially saying that the person it's addressed to has been confirmed as a citizen of Paraguay, and we are awaiting their details and photographs to produce a passport. These documents would be used by the recipients effectively to facilitate a way out of the ghetto or an exemption perhaps from a deportation list. Passport holders would generally then be sent by the Germans to detention camps for foreign nationals, such as at Vittel in occupied France, where their survival was still far from guaranteed, but at least they were removed, temporarily at least, from the murderous machinery of the Holocaust. We come out of that now. So what did the Wadash group achieve? As we know, starting in earnest in 1942, they produced a variety of Latin American passports and citizenship documents, mostly Paraguayan, but also from Honduras, Haiti, and Peru, which were issued to an estimated 8,000 to 10,000 people, the majority of them of Polish origin. According to the research already carried out, amongst others by the Pilecki Institute, nearly 3,000 of these passport holders have been identified, of whom over 800 survived the war. Extrapolating from those figures suggests that in total, between 2,000 and 3,000 Wadash passport holders may have survived, making this one of the largest rescue operations of the Holocaust. Larger, for instance, than Oskar Schindler's famed rescue of some 1,200 Jews in Kazimierz in Krakow. The reason that the story of the Wadash operation has only recently been unearthed deserves some explanation. Firstly, none of the members of the Wadash group themselves left diaries or memoirs, with the exception of Wadash himself, as we'll come to later on, but that diary was incomplete and ended prior to the, ended in 1939, prior to this operation, so it doesn't tell us much. And all of those members of the Wadash group effectively disappeared from public life after 1945. Chaim Eis indeed already died in 1943, and the diplomats involved were all removed from service or left service with the arrival of the communist regime in Poland in 1945. So none of them, none of the six, effectively left their mark on the historiography of the Holocaust. None of them left a memoir, none of them told their own story of what they had done. On top of that, it appears that the vast majority of those that received Wadash passports, even if they survived the war, did not have much of an idea of where those passports had come from. For most, they had perhaps sent a request to a representative of an aid organization, and in due course, they had received a passport in return. But for the vast majority, that was all they knew. They had no idea of the name Wadash or of any of the other individuals involved, no idea even of the central role played by Polish diplomats in the process. Therefore, though phrases like Latin American passports or even Paraguayan passports are occasionally mentioned in the memoirs of Holocaust survivors, there was no knowledge of the wider story to be told. So that wider story generally didn't get told. And the example of one recipient, I think, is quite instructive here. The mother of a British political journalist, Danny Finkelstein, who some of you might know, her name was Miriam Wiener, and she was a German-born Jew who survived the Holocaust thanks to a Wadash Paraguayan passport. And though she died in 2017 and spent much of her life teaching and lecturing about the Holocaust, Miriam never knew where her Paraguayan passport had come from. And it was only through social media and via subsequent correspondence with Mr. Finkelstein by myself and others that the full story behind that Paraguayan passport emerged. By way of explaining the context behind the passport operation, a brief foray into the wider history is required. From September 1939 to June of 1941, Poland was subjected to a dual occupation by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, which changed to an occupation solely by Nazi Germany with the German invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. Throughout the war, Poland's government in exile, first in France, Poland's government was in exile, first in France, then in London, and its writ was carried in the home territory as far as was possible by the Polish underground. Under German occupation, Poles and Jews were confined to the very lowest rungs of the Nazi racial hierarchy, with Poles persecuted initially by the German authorities by way of decapitating Polish society and disabling any possible national resistance, while Jews were isolated, marginalized, and confined to ghettos prior to their wholesale extermination at German hands, which began in the second half of 1941. Under Soviet occupation from 1939 to 41, class criteria were applied, and both Poles and Jews suffered accordingly. In the latter case, those that were comparatively wealthy or religiously observant. Nonetheless, the Soviet area of occupation often served, until 1941, as something of a haven for Polish Jews fleeing from the more immediately deadly persecution of the Germans. Even prior to the Holocaust beginning in earnest in the second half of 1941, Jews in occupied Poland faced myriad problems and privations, from starvation, rationing, and disease to persecution and ghettoization. But on a more fundamental level, I would argue that they faced a problem of delegitimation. With the establishment of the German occupation regime, the general government, in October of 1939, all former Polish identity documents were declared null and void. And though all former Polish citizens were required to carry some form of identification with them on pain of death, those documents conferred on their holders no legal or civil rights at all. Both Poles and Jews were therefore effectively subject to the whim of their German rulers. And this was the legal framework, or rather one could say the legal vacuum, that the German authorities created and by which they were able to carry out their racial segregation of Polish society. When the time came for deportation or for the ghettos to be liquidated, there was therefore no legal impediment to German action. It may seem strange, perhaps, to talk about legal abstracts when we're discussing the Holocaust, but it is a crucial aspect of the story, and it's one that often, I think, gets overlooked. For all its crimes, Germany under Nazi rule, and I stress Germany rather than occupied territories beyond, Germany under Nazi rule was still a Rechtsstaat, a state governed by the rule of law. And that rule of law could be twisted, it could be perverted, but it was still there. To explain this point, we should perhaps consider the lengths that the Nazi regime went to give its nefarious activities the veneer of legality. Arbitrary arrests by the Gestapo, for example, were legalized by the production of a Schutzhaftbefehl, a protective custody order, by which the normal legal procedures could be legally bypassed. Similarly, once German Jews began to be deported eastward in the winter of 1941-42, the deportation notices that were sent out to each household carried on their front page the 4 paragraphs of German law upon which that deportation was based. So to refuse your scheduled deportation was a criminal offence. The situation outside Germany itself, once Germany takes over neighbouring territories such as Poland after 1939, particularly in that German-occupied East, the situation there was obviously rather less punctilious in legal matters, but those same legal instincts, I would suggest, were still present. The historian Timothy Snyder has described the Nazis' process of preparing the ground for the Holocaust in Central and Eastern Europe as the creation of what he calls a lawless space. He's right, of course, but not in the sense that occupied Poland became something akin to the Wild West, but rather that the Nazi regime created a situation in which subject populations were literally beyond the protection of the law, both Poles and Jews. This extra legal predicament also applied to those German Jews deported into the ghettos in occupied Poland, as well as to Minsk, Riga, and elsewhere from the autumn of 1941 onwards. They had already been stripped of their Reich citizenship by the Nuremberg laws of 1935, and so had forfeited their political and civil rights. Furthermore, the Reich Citizenship Act of November 1941 had decreed that Jews forfeited their remaining rights, their assets and their property upon their deportation, technically upon leaving the Reich. As a consequence, those that arrived from Germany into the ghettos of Warsaw or Łódź, of course, was annexed directly to the Reich, so a slightly different case, but those deported into those areas enjoyed the same legal status as their fellows already living there, which is precisely none. They enjoyed no legal status whatsoever. So the Nazi regime was deliberately creating an extra legal space, a space beyond law, in which to put the Jews under its control. And from there was no legal obstacle or impediment beyond the logistical to their further deportation or extermination. And this is why the Wadash operation, the passport operation, was so significant. What started out as a legitimate exercise in assisting Polish Jews who were desperate to find a route out of both the German and the Soviet zones of occupation, evolved by the time that the Holocaust gets underway in earnest in 1941, late 41, 42, into the creation of a quasi-legal obstacle to deportation and murder. Those that could claim Paraguayan or Peruvian citizenship, however spurious that must have seemed, would be spared deportation, simply because that claim to Paraguayan citizenship raised the possibility that a legal framework was once again present. The German authorities involved, the SS or Gestapo, did not have to believe that the individual before them was actually a Paraguayan citizen. And in many cases, it seems they didn't. But the possibility was enough to force them to stay their hand, at least temporarily. Given this significance, we have to ask ourselves how the operation came about, to see where its origins lay. The first place to look for origins, perhaps, is the Polish government in exile, which formed in France late in 1939 before moving to London in May of 1940. Led by General Władysław Sikorski, it positioned itself in many ways as the antithesis of the Sanacja regime that had run Poland in the years up to 1939, and so was made up of many politicians who had opposed or been excluded from or by that pre-1939 leadership. Nonetheless, the exile government, like the wider exile community, was a broad church with many of the same divisions, factions, and indeed prejudices represented as were represented in Polish society generally. There were tensions aplenty, not least around the question of how Poland's Jews should be treated and what sort of role they should have in any future reconstituted Poland. Such questions were partially addressed by the Stańczyk Declaration of November 1940, by which the government in exile promised equal rights and tolerance to Jews in any future Poland. But the discussions around this issue, as with so many others, nonetheless rumbled on. Of course, Poland's diplomats were to a large extent political appointees, those that could be relied upon to chime with the Sikorski government and follow the policy guidelines and positions that they were given. One of them was Alexander Wadash, who had been an opposition journalist during the Sanacja years and had briefly served as a minister in Sikorski's exile government in 1939-40. He was appointed to the embassy at Switzerland in the spring of 1940, a posting that was strategically very significant, given that Switzerland, then of course a neutral island of democracy in the heart of Europe, was a potentially vital staging post, both for refugees and for the couriers that were already maintaining contact between occupied Poland and the Sikorski government in London. There were a number of other Polish diplomats who were also active in aiding Jewish refugees at this time, not least among them Tadeusz Roma in Tokyo, of whom we'll speak more in a moment, and Wojciech Rychlewicz, who was the Polish consul in Istanbul, who issued certificates of religious affiliation to Jewish refugees, declaring them to be Catholics and thereby easing their applications for visas for their onward journey. This is evidence in a way of the same widespread anti-Semitism across the world, actually. It's not just a German phenomenon, sadly. This was evidence of that, because what Rychlewicz was trying to counteract was the fact that a lot of countries allowed a quota for Polish refugees, but only in the event that they were not Jewish. So that if they could prove that they were Roman Catholic, if they had some documentation to show that they were Catholic, then they could get onto a quota. I think Brazil was one of those countries that operated this policy. So Rychlewicz was trying to sort of circumvent this, if you like, built-in anti-Semitism within the visa system of a number of countries by issuing these certificates of religious affiliation. Another example is that of Jan Małaczyński, who was the consul in Marseille, who supplied bogus identity documents for many of the fugitives in the escape line that was run by the American philanthropist Varian Fry. One might surmise from this that Polish diplomats had been instructed to aid Jewish and Polish refugees. Of course, that's a large part of the diplomat's job in wartime, is to aid their own citizens. But one might imagine that from this, that they had been given some sort of blanket instruction. But we should be wary of confusing correlation with causation. And despite the actions of those individuals, and there are almost certainly other examples yet to be discovered, there is no evidence yet that, aside from a benign and supportive attitude towards refugees, any instruction was given from the exile government to its representatives to act in a certain way. A stronger influence, perhaps, in the development of the Wadash operation is the example of the Japanese consul in Kaunas, Lithuania in 1940, Kyune Sugihara, who distributed Japanese transit visas, which, along with colonial visas issued by his Dutch counterpart Jan Zwartendijk, enabled many thousands of mainly Polish Jews to escape eastward through the Soviet Union via Japan to safety. Sugihara's actions are today quite well known, certainly rather better known than those of Wadash. Yet, for our purposes today, they have an interesting connection, and that is of the Polish links in the Sugihara chain. Firstly, two Polish intelligence officers, Captain Alfons Jakubianiec and Lieutenant Leszek Daszkiewicz, cooperated closely with Sugihara, traveling across the Baltic states and beyond, using Manchurian passports supplied by Sugihara himself, and then sharing the resulting intelligence that they had gleaned with him. In return, Sugihara used Japanese diplomatic mail to allow them to send correspondence safely to the government in exile in London. More than this, it has been suggested that the two Poles even played a role in the genesis of Sugihara's visa operation. And though this has been disputed, it's nonetheless clear that the professional relationship between the three men was a close one. When he left Kaunas in the autumn of 1940, Sugihara offered both of them positions in his new consulate in Königsberg, as well as, incidentally, Japanese citizenship. Secondarily, Sugihara's refugees were further assisted by the Polish minister in Tokyo, Tadeusz Romer, when they reached Japanese shores. It was Romer who was obliged to establish accommodation and assistance networks to feed and house them and to prepare their papers for their onward journeys. All of this he communicated to the government in exile in London, though seemingly without mentioning the name of Sugihara, if indeed that name was even known to him. So in effect, he was dealing with the results of the Sugihara operation without necessarily knowing how those large numbers of refugees had come about and had appeared on his doorstep. Nonetheless, via these two routes, the intelligence officers in Kaunas and the minister in Tokyo, Sikorski's government in exile must have known at least the essentials of the Sugihara operation. as I've said, perhaps not the name of Sugihara, but they must have been aware of those, or they certainly were aware of those large numbers of Polish refugees appearing in Japan in 1940, late 40 and early 41. The Sugihara operation was certainly known to one of Wadash's earliest recorded passport recipients. Leo Weingart was 21 years old in 1941. He'd been born in Bielsko in southwestern Poland and had moved east with the outbreak of war and had found refuge in Lwów in the Soviet area of occupation. By 1941, however, Weingart was increasingly worried about the oppression of the Soviet regime, which was ramping up at that point. This is obviously prior to the German invasion, and he was keen to leave. So he wrote to his brother, Saul, who was a rabbi in a Jewish school in Montreux in Switzerland, to ask for help and suggesting that the acquisition of a Latin American passport, as he put it, might be a way forward. Now, given that some of Leo's correspondence to his family had been sent from Kaunas, despite him living formerly in Lwów, it appears that he must have had some reason to travel there at that time. This, I suggest, is how it might be likely that he came to know of the Sugihara operation and of the potential of the Latin American passports connection. Thus prompted, his brother Saul duly inquired at the Polish embassy in Bern, where he spoke with Juliusz Kuhl. Kuhl told him that Latin American passports could indeed be sourced, but that they could only be used for the trip eastward, across and out of the Soviet Union. Throughout, it appears in that discussion, Kuhl was rather unenthusiastic. He kept stressing that he couldn't give any guarantees that this ruse would work, and he cautioned that he had only heard that others had tried the same method. One might reasonably surmise from these comments that the Polish embassy in Bern was already well aware of the Sugihara route and that they already seen the potential in forging Latin American passports. This indeed does appear to be the case, as it appears that a few other Latin American passports had already been issued by them prior to Weingart's request. However, unfortunately, those examples have not survived and, crucially, not been recorded. In due course, Leo Weingart did indeed receive his Paraguayan passport, along with a note reminding him to apply for a Japanese transit visa when he arrived there. By way of a footnote, it's worth mentioning that Weingart delayed his departure. He received his passport early in 1941. He delayed his departure from Lwów as he wanted to find or source an additional passport for his fiancée. And so he was caught up in the German invasion eastward in June of 1941. And sadly, Leo Weingart did not survive the war. Another early recipient of a Wadash passport was the French socialist politician Pierre Mendès France, who'd been imprisoned by the Vichy regime in the summer of 1941, but escaped to Switzerland in early August. Wanting to get to de Gaulle and the Free French in London, Mendès France could not travel under his own name, and in any case he was Jewish, so that gave an additional peril. So through the mediation of Abraham Silberschein, with whom he was already in touch, he was provided with a Polish passport in the name of Jan Lemberg, as well as a Cuban visa for his onward journey. And all of this, of course, enabled him to travel to Spain and then on to London to join de Gaulle. It would perhaps be unwise to attach too much significance to the case of Mendès France. After all, it would be easy to dismiss him as an outlier, perhaps because of his status as a prominent French politician and as a fugitive. However, I think that at the very least, his case, his example, shows us two things. Firstly, that the Polish embassy in Bern was willing to produce its own documents for essentially fraudulent purposes, albeit in the service of an allied cause. And secondly, I think it shows the beginnings of that collaboration between the members of the Wadash group within the embassy and the Jewish organizations beyond, a feature that would prove crucial as the operation went forward. The last example to look at is that of Guter Eisensweig, a young Jew living in Warsaw who, through a suitor, Eli Sternbuch, received a Paraguayan passport in November 1941, a passport that would ultimately enable her to survive the war. That passport, I would argue, also crystallized the various strands of the Wadash story into an integral whole. It came about because that suitor, Eli Sternbuch, lived in Switzerland, where he was already active in Jewish aid circles, assisting those that had already got to Switzerland and sending aid packages to, amongst other places, the Warsaw Ghetto. In this connection, he made two important acquaintances. Firstly, to Saul Weingart, who we just mentioned, the brother of Leo, who had already supplied that Paraguayan passport to his brother in Lvov. And secondly, to Chaim Eis, the Swiss representative of Agudat Israel, the aid organization, and the sixth member of the Wadash group. So I would argue through this example, the six actually came together. Though the precise timeline is a little difficult to divine for sure, I would suggest that it is highly likely that Sternbuch was inspired to request the Paraguayan passport for Guter Eisensweig after hearing from Saul Weingart about his experience with his brother Leo. In turn, the connection that both Sternbuch and Weingart had with Chaim Eis provided not only the infrastructure, but also the knowledge and the finances that would prove so vitally important once the Wadash operation expanded during 1942. It's perhaps telling that those like Guter Eisensweig in the Warsaw Ghetto tended to refer to the passports in code as packages, a reference perhaps to the aid parcels that had prior to that point been supplied by Sternbuch, Weingart, and the Agudat Israel. From then, word quickly spread through the Warsaw Ghetto and beyond, and very quickly the Jewish relief organizations in Switzerland, headed by Chaim Eis and Abraham Silberschein, were being deluged with requests for Latin American passports. In June of 1942, just as the wholesale deportation and slaughter of Polish Jews was getting underway, Chaim Eis wrote to Julius Kuhl, listing the various requests for passports that he had received from occupied Poland and asking, what should I do? With that question, I suggest, the Wadash group was born. Already that summer, a poem was doing the rounds of the Warsaw Ghetto, penned by the Yiddish poet Władysław Schlengel, which expressed the wish, I would like to have a Paraguayan passport. Rich and free is this land. I would like to have a Uruguayan passport, or Costa Rica, or Paraguay, in order to live peacefully here in Warsaw. It's clear from that that the rumor mill, the Bush Telegraph of the Warsaw Ghetto, was already rife with this idea that a Paraguayan passport was a way out for those trapped there. So what conclusions can we draw about the origins of the Wadash operation? Firstly, I would argue there is little beyond a personal and moral bravery in the essential character of the members of the Wadash group that appears to have dictated that they would act in the way that they did. Three of them, of course, are Jewish, two of them already involved in Jewish aid and rescue operations. So the motivation for them is most likely obvious. It's one of Jewish solidarity. Of the other three, there is little evidence available to guide us to any sort of character-based conclusion. Of those three, only Wadash left a memoir, as I've mentioned, but that memoir was unfinished and never published, and it stops short with the outbreak of war in 1939. So it doesn't shed any light on why he did what he did. Consequently, there is very little in the way of first-hand material which has survived to illuminate the precise motives of the actors beyond the obvious. So those motives can only really be speculated upon. Tantalizingly, Wadash himself had a history as a passport forger. In 1915, he was exiled to Tyrol by the Habsburg authorities, and while there had a passport made in a friend's name, which he used to get a visa to escape to, you guessed it, Switzerland. This might appear to the unwary to look like a smoking gun, an example from his own life that perhaps inspired his actions later on. I would urge caution on this, however. I would suggest that Poles of his generation, living under the partitions as they were at the time, would have been relatively familiar with the underhand and illegal methods of the conspiracja, including forgery. And this question, I think, applies to Poles as a whole. The idea of forging official documents was something that at the time horrified the Swiss, and yet for the Poles of that generation, it was comparatively normal behavior, certainly in extremis during the perils of warfare. So I think this idea of a willingness to engage in forgery doesn't necessarily just apply to Wadash. You can say that that would apply to any Polish diplomat of his generation, because it was purely the world that they'd grown up in to a large extent. So I think in the case of Wadash, perhaps his motivation for his later actions is simpler than that. It is really, as he himself explained to his Swiss interrogators as they tried to shut the operation down in 1943, he explained, "This is a humanitarian operation. We aim to save as many Jews as is possible." Secondly, I would suggest that we should be wary of any sort of great man interpretation of this story. And again, this is not to deny the moral bravery of those who assisted and who made the operation possible. Rather, it is to acknowledge that no one individual drove those events along. There was no Oskar Schindler forcing the pace through his own character and his own abilities. The role of Wadash himself in Bern was primarily that of overseer and protector. And though the importance of that task should not be underestimated, especially when the group came under the scrutiny of the Swiss police in 1943, it is clear that he did not, indeed he could not, have carried out the operation alone. Neither, in fact, could any of the other five. Each of them had their crucial role to play. Thirdly, it appears that the Polish government in exile was not particularly instrumental in the genesis of the Wadash operation. Though the Sikorski government in London was broadly sympathetic and must have known something about Sugihara's actions in Kaunas, as I've explained, either through Tadeusz Roma or through its own intelligence agents in Lithuania, and it certainly knew about the result of Sugihara's actions, i.e. the large numbers of Polish Jewish refugees arriving in Japan, but there nonetheless does not appear to be any instruction from London for Polish diplomats abroad to act in a particular way with regard to Polish Jewish refugees. Indeed, it's been suggested that the government in exile knew of the Wadash group's activities was in the summer of 1943, when they were alerted to them by Jewish aid agencies. By that time, of course, the group had been active in supplying Latin American passports for more than a year. So when we're seeking the origins of the Wadash group's passport operation, perhaps we should conclude that as much as anything, it was circumstances. History, as it is popularly understood, invariably requires a boiled down, simplified narrative, perhaps of individual heroism or of inspiration or even of malice. Yet, as historians, we're trained to examine the evidence dispassionately, to embrace the complexity and the nuance, and to weigh up the competing claims to influence. And seen in this way, the genesis of the Wadash group is, I think, quite clear. It was a group of men coming together to do what they could to assist those in dire need. And crucially, they were able to do that because they were in the relative safety of Switzerland, with access to funds, to the outside world, and to friendly consulates willing, at a price, to provide passports and identity documents. The plan that they devised was similarly serendipitous in its origins. From Sugihara's example in Kaunas, via Leo Weingart in Lvov, to his brother Saul in Montreux, and then adapted by the connection to Eli Sternbuch and the Jewish aid organizations, it became a veritable cottage industry, which in due course would issue as many as 10,000 Latin American passports, enabling perhaps a third of that number of Jews to survive the war. Right people, right place, right time. It's a reminder perhaps that chance sometimes has more of a role to play in history than we think. Thank you.